Every civilization that ever accumulated great wealth managed to do so while keeping the vast majority of its population at the edge of subsistence. That is not a political observation. That is the historical record, running unbroken for roughly 4,000 years. The broad middle class, defined by homeownership, retirement savings, and upward mobility for your children, did not emerge from the natural logic of markets growing more sophisticated. It emerged from a specific, unrepeatable collision of catastrophe, geopolitical fear, and industrial geography that lasted, at its most generous estimate, about 30 years. The question worth asking right now is not whether inequality is rising. It clearly is. The deeper question is whether we are living through a temporary deviation from a post-war norm, or whether we are structurally returning to the actual historical default, an economy capable of generating extraordinary aggregate wealth while distributing almost none of it broadly. That distinction matters enormously, because if the post-war middle class was a temporary anomaly, then the financial advice, the retirement models, the career strategies, and the political promises built on its assumptions are all calibrated for a world that no longer exists. For most of recorded history, economies organized around a simple ownership principle. Whoever controlled the productive asset controlled the economic outcome. In agrarian civilizations, that asset was land. In ancient Mesopotamia, in dynastic China, in the estates of the late Roman Empire, productive land was held by an extraordinarily narrow ownership class. The people who worked that land received enough to survive and continue working, not much more. Historians studying ancient living standards estimate that in most pre-industrial economies, between 70 and 85% of the population consumed at or barely above subsistence level. This was not because these economies were small. The late Roman Empire, at its territorial peak, generated impressive total output: aqueducts, roads, administrative systems of genuine sophistication. But the distribution of that output was brutally narrow. The senatorial class, representing a fraction of 1% of the population, held wealth that would seem extraordinary even by modern standards. The peasant majority held essentially nothing that could compound across generations. This is the historical default. Not poverty caused by low total output, poverty caused by an ownership structure that systematically prevented broad accumulation. Medieval European feudalism replicated this structure almost perfectly under a different institutional name. The serf did not own the land. The craftsman in a guild town had modest stability, but capital accumulation across generations was structurally constrained by inheritance customs, religious restrictions on lending, and the absence of any financial infrastructure that could convert labor income into productive assets. The merchant class in certain trading cities produced something closer to a propertied middle layer, but these were exceptional nodes in an otherwise flat economic landscape. The critical structural insight is this: the economic architecture was built around asset concentration that made broad wealth distribution structurally impossible, regardless of aggregate output. This matters because the same principle, assets concentrated in few hands, labor receiving subsistence wages, does not require medieval technology to operate. It requires only that owners of productive assets face no meaningful pressure to share the returns, and for most of history, they faced none. The Industrial Revolution appeared to offer a structural break from this pattern. In one narrow sense, it did. It created wage labor at scale, which meant millions of people previously tied to land were now legally free individuals selling their labor on an open market. But legal freedom and economic leverage are not the same thing. The early industrial economy demonstrated this distinction with considerable brutality. Between roughly 1760 and 1850 in Britain, and continuing across continental Europe and North America through the late 19th century, industrial output grew at rates unprecedented in human history. Real gross domestic product per capita in Britain roughly doubled during the first century of industrialization, and yet real wages of the industrial working class during large portions of this period barely moved. Economic historians have identified what they call the Engels pause, named after Friedrich Engels, who documented Manchester's industrial poverty in the 1840s, a prolonged interval during which productivity gains did not translate into broader living standard improvements for workers. Why? Because of what we might call the replaceability trap. A wage earner's bargaining power is functionally determined by one variable: how difficult are they to replace? In the early industrial period, most factory workers were not difficult to replace at all. Urbanization was pushing millions of displaced agricultural workers into industrial cities. Skills required for most factory floor work were learned quickly, and crucially, capital, the mills, the machines, was geographically fixed. The mill was in Manchester, but the individual worker at a specific loom was interchangeable with a very large pool of available substitutes. Low replaceability equals low bargaining power. Low bargaining power means wages settle near subsistence. This is not a moral failing of Victorian industrialists. It is the mechanical operation of a labor market where supply vastly exceeds demand for any specific worker's contribution. By the late 19th century, the United States and Western Europe had built some of the most productive economies in human history, and also produced urban industrial poverty at scale, working hours averaging well over 60 per week in many sectors, and negligible asset ownership among the wage-earning majority. This was not capitalism failing. This was capitalism operating exactly as its structural logic dictated. Returns flow to asset owners, wages reflect replaceability, and broadly shared prosperity requires something external to the market mechanism to force it into existence. Between 1914 and 1945, the world's major industrialized economies experienced a sequence of shocks so severe that they accidentally created the conditions for the most broadly shared prosperity in human history. 2 world wars, a global depression, the physical destruction of capital stock across Europe and Asia, and the rise of a credible ideological competitor in the Soviet Union combined to produce something 4,000 years of economic history had never reliably delivered: genuine structural bargaining power for ordinary wage workers in Western economies. Consider what the Second World War specifically did to the American labor market. Approximately 16 million Americans entered military service between 1941 and 1945. Roughly 11% of the entire population removed from the civilian labor force at the precise moment when industrial production was demanded at historically unprecedented levels. Workers were suddenly not easy to replace. Employers competed for available labor rather than the reverse. This structural scarcity created conditions for real wage increases that had been impossible to achieve through market mechanisms alone for the previous century. The geopolitical dimension is equally important and frequently underappreciated. After 1947, Western governments faced an explicit ideological competition with Soviet communism. The Soviet model offered a powerful rhetorical argument. Capitalism concentrates wealth among owners while impoverishing workers. That argument was demonstrably true of the pre-1940 capitalist record. Western policymakers understood that if capitalism was to prevail, it needed to produce visible prosperity for ordinary workers, not just aggregate growth statistics that accrued to the ownership class. This created something genuinely unprecedented: deliberate political pressure to engineer a broadly prosperous middle class as a strategic objective. Federal mortgage guarantee programs, progressive tax structures with top marginal rates exceeding 90% in the early post-war decades, and strong institutional support for collective bargaining all reflected a consensus that markets alone would not produce the prosperity needed to demonstrate capitalism's ideological superiority. And it worked. Between roughly 1945 and 1973, real median household income in the United States roughly doubled. Home ownership rates rose from under 50% to over 60%. Union membership in the private sector reached its historical maximum. For one generation of workers, concentrated in manufacturing, the wage-labor relationship delivered something historically extraordinary: genuine upward mobility and meaningful asset accumulation. This is the golden age that most conventional economic thinking treats as the baseline. But it was built on conditions so historically contingent that reproducing them requires not just good policy, but the same extraordinary alignment of geopolitical pressure, labor scarcity, capital immobility, and ideological urgency that created them. That alignment dissolved around 1973. It has not returned. If overall economic productivity in the United States has roughly doubled since 1979, why does homeownership feel less accessible to the median worker today than it did then? Why does retirement feel less secure? Why do real wages for the median worker show only modest gains over nearly 5 decades of enormous aggregate growth? The productivity-wage decoupling that became statistically visible in the mid-1970s is not a mystery. It is the predictable consequence of a structural shift in capital mobility, the single most important economic development of the late 20th century. In the post-war economy, capital was relatively immobile. A manufacturer could not easily shift production to a lower-wage jurisdiction. Productive capital was physically embedded in specific geographic locations, which gave local workers structural leverage. There was literally no one else to do the job. Beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1990s, three simultaneous developments destroyed this geographic anchor. First, containerized global shipping reduced the cost of moving physical goods across oceans to the point that manufacturing became genuinely footloose. Labor cost differentials across countries could be arbitraged at scale for the first time. Second, financial deregulation removed controls on capital flows embedded in the Bretton Woods framework, allowing capital to move across jurisdictions with speed impossible in 1955. Third, the Cold War's ideological urgency faded as Soviet economic stagnation became visible, reducing political pressure on Western governments to maintain generous labor institutions. The practical result was a fundamental shift in bargaining power. The threat, "we will move production somewhere else," became credible and then routine. Once credible, it suppressed wage demands even where relocation was impractical, because the credible threat itself was sufficient. The data is unambiguous. From 1948 to 1973, productivity growth and median compensation grew in near-perfect parallel. Both roughly doubled. From 1973 to the present, productivity continued rising by well over 150%, while median hourly compensation grew by a fraction of that. The gap between those two lines does not measure economic failure in aggregate terms. Total output kept growing. Corporate profits reached records. Asset values compounded impressively. It measures where growth went, overwhelmingly to capital owners rather than wage earners. The ownership regime had reasserted its historical logic. Once capital regained mobility and labor lost geographic leverage, distribution of economic gains reverted toward the historical pattern, concentrated at the top of the ownership structure, modest at the median, stagnant at the bottom. The middle class did not dissolve because people stopped working hard. It dissolved because the structural conditions that had forced capital to share returns were progressively eliminated by the same forces simultaneously driving aggregate growth. Artificial intelligence and advanced automation are not simply faster versions of previous labor-saving technologies. Previous automation, the mechanized loom, the assembly line robot, the spreadsheet, tended to eliminate specific physical or clerical tasks while leaving intact the broader domain of cognitive and analytical work that the professional middle class performs. The implicit assumption through the early 21st century was that cognitive work, engineering, analysis, law, medicine, was structurally protected by its complexity. That assumption is now under serious empirical pressure. Large language models and generative AI systems are demonstrating the ability to perform at high levels across domains previously considered exclusively human cognitive territory. They draft legal documents, generate financial analysis, write code, and produce diagnostic reasoning. Not perfectly, but at a cost and speed that creates genuine replaceability pressure on the professional cognitive workforce in ways that were not structurally possible a decade ago. What does history tell us about what happens when replaceability increases dramatically in a previously protected labor category? The record is consistent. When workers become easier to replace, their bargaining power falls. When bargaining power falls, their share of economic output falls with it. Productivity gains flow to whoever owns the productive technology. In the era of the mechanized loom, that was the mill owner. In the era of containerized supply chains, it was the multinational corporation. In the era of artificial intelligence, it will be whoever holds the AI infrastructure, the proprietary models, and the data assets that make those models useful. The current distribution of those assets warrants serious analytical attention. The computing infrastructure underlying modern AI is held by a small number of hyperscale technology companies. The proprietary data required to train useful AI systems is similarly concentrated. The capital required to compete in AI development is measured in tens of billions of dollars. a barrier that effectively excludes individuals and small organizations from participating on the ownership side. This is legible through the analytical framework built throughout this analysis. An economy where the productive asset is broadly distributed produces broadly shared returns. An economy where the productive asset is narrowly concentrated produces narrowly concentrated returns, regardless of aggregate output. Land in feudal Europe was concentrated. Industrial capital in the Gilded Age was concentrated. Digital and AI infrastructure today is concentrated. The pattern is structural, not ideological. The genuinely open empirical question is whether political and institutional responses to AI-driven concentration will produce a new leverage moment analogous to the post-war era, or whether the characteristics of digital capital make that kind of redistribution structurally more difficult this time. There are substantive arguments on both sides. Digital goods have near-zero marginal cost, meaning access to AI tools could theoretically be broadly distributed without the physical constraints that limited industrial capital. Some economists argue AI will function as a general-purpose productivity amplifier, raising wages across skill levels as it complements human judgment. On the other side, the gap between accessing a tool and owning the infrastructure that generates returns from that tool is enormous and historically decisive. Factory workers in 1900 had access to the machines they operated. They did not capture the returns those machines generated. Access and ownership are structurally distinct categories, and history is consistent about which one determines long-term economic trajectory. Step back from the chronological detail, and a relatively simple structural model emerges with profound implications. For most of recorded history, economies organized around ownership of a scarce productive asset. Owners captured the majority of economic returns. Workers who did not own received wages calibrated to their replaceability, close to subsistence for the easily replaced majority, modest premiums for specialized minorities. For roughly 30 years in the middle of the 20th century, an extraordinary alignment, labor scarcity from mass mobilization, capital immobility from geographic constraints, political urgency from ideological competition, and deliberate institutional reinforcement compressed that ownership advantage and forced broader distribution of returns. The result was the only sustained period of genuinely broad middle-class prosperity in the recorded economic history of advanced industrial societies. Then the conditions dissolved. Capital became mobile. Labor became replaceable at scale. Ideological urgency faded. Economic returns began flowing back toward their historical resting point, concentrated in the hands of those who owned the productive assets. Here is the most sobering implication. The political consensus that forced capital to yield in the post-war era was not produced by idealism alone. It was produced by genuine existential pressure, competing ideologies, the physical destruction of existing capital structures, and labor scarcity from catastrophic war. The conditions that created the prosperity were themselves terrible. They are not a comforting model for replication without the catastrophe. This is not a counsel of despair. It is a counsel of clarity. The frameworks most people use to understand their economic position were built during an era that was structurally unprecedented and is now demonstrably over. Operating with outdated frameworks in a changed structural environment produces predictable errors, not because the individual is failing, but because the map no longer matches the terrain. The practical implication drawn from the historical record is straightforward if not easy. In every era where ownership of productive assets has been concentrated, individuals who achieved meaningful long-term economic security found ways to participate in ownership, not just in wage earning. This is not a statement about what the world should look like. It is a description of how the world has consistently operated across every ownership regime, from feudal land tenure to industrial capital to digital infrastructure. Wages are a flow, assets are a stock. In every historical era where structural balance tilts toward capital owners, stocks compound while flows stagnate. The ratio between what you earn from labor and what you earn from assets you own is, historically, a more reliable predictor of long-term trajectory within any given ownership regime than almost any other single variable. The middle class was not a gift that advanced economies naturally bestow on their populations as they grow more sophisticated. It was a delicate equilibrium built on leverage, institutions, and specific historical conditions that took a world war and an existential ideological competition to create, and that began unwinding the moment those external pressures relaxed. Whether the 21st century will find new structural mechanisms to broaden ownership and restore that equilibrium remains genuinely open, but it will not answer itself, and it will not be answered by waiting for markets to generate broad prosperity spontaneously. Markets have had 4,000 years to demonstrate that tendency. The historical record on that point is unambiguous. If this kind of structural, historically grounded analysis helps you see the forces shaping your own financial reality more clearly, consider subscribing and sharing this with someone working through why the conventional economic wisdom they were raised on no longer matches their lived experience. The central question of our era remains: will the technologies and institutions of the 21st century find a way to broaden ownership of productive assets, or will they accelerate the concentration that has been the historical default for nearly all of recorded civilization? And more specifically, when you examine your own economic position honestly, how much of your long-term security rests on assets that compound independently of your labor versus income that stops the moment you do? That is the structural question this history asks each of us to answer for ourselves.